I've had a few people ask about my table saw. It's essentially my version of a job site saw, similar to like the old Triton Work Centre. You would buy this pressed metal top with legs that folded out so that you could stick a jigsaw or a circular saw or a router underneath it. I made this, or I put this together back in about 2013, and the feet of it you would have seen when I was bringing it out. It's basically folds out. It was one of those old little handy jaw things that has two sets of jaws so you can wind them in and out. You can still see the handles here and the screw thread, and I just took this off. Welcome to Australia. Yeah, little bugger. What I basically did when I was making this was I looked through my shed to see if I had a piece of plywood that wasn't too thick. So I was looking for, this is a 12mm or a 1/2 inch thickness piece of plywood, and I just took it at the width that it came at. So it's not really wide, so it is like a little job site saw. And all I did was set the arms. Like this one's the adjustable thing for when you have those jaws open and shut. And I just set that out and screwed this under here. I ended up getting the saw and just drilling a couple of holes into the base plate and screwing it into the plywood. I'm using some washers just so there was a bit more meat behind it, and so the screws didn't go all the way through the plywood. And with it under here, I can still adjust the angle of the blade, and the depth of the blade is really easy to adjust. The height of the blade, just basically adjustable. I don't get a really deep cut with this because it's 1/2 inch and it's just screwed up underneath, so I'm losing a 1/2 inch of the depth that this would normally cut at. But if I wanted to set any sort of depth, I've got that. My on-off switch, it's a little dodgy. I just ran the wire straight out from the actual switch controller in there. You can see the top section is a little bit wider now. I'd really prefer to have a zero clearance groove here, and I did originally until I wanted to do some bevel cuts a few years back, and I realized that as soon as I angled that I couldn't get out of the same hole, so I ended up having to get a router and trimming that out a little bit. I originally had, might be able to just see, you can see some little graduations here. I had millimeters and inches marked distances away from the blade, because my fence for the saw is basically just a straight cut piece of timber with an F clamp or a spring clamp at both ends. And my first fence ended up getting a little bit bashed about when I first made it. This one I made in 2014 and it's still going strong. My original reason for doing this was I was renovating my kitchen. I almost killed this saw. Well, actually I did kill this saw. I was cutting up a lot of material, and all of a sudden it just stopped working. I couldn't get it to work, and I was halfway through building something for the kitchen. I ended up running out and buying another saw, and I got an AEG, which only just died last year, which I replaced with a smaller version of the Makita. This one here, I've already said the power of it, haven't I? I didn't want to get rid of my saw. I couldn't give up on it. I'm a tinkerer. I completely dismantled the saw. Turned out the brushes were just dirty, and the commutator was completely filthy. I cleaned that off with some steel wool, cleaned the brushes, put it back together, pulled the trigger, it worked. I'd already bought another saw, so I thought, what can I do with this one? So I turned it into this. So this is a 235mm or a 10-inch saw. No, so 9.5, 9.25. It's really served me well. It's bitten me once. A few years back when I was trimming stuff, nasty bite of this, but lost half that fingernail. It grew back. But anyway, you'll notice I've got a couple of pieces of wood sticking out this side. These bits of wood here are just jammed into these gaps. A couple of wedges to make sure they stayed in, so that I could clamp the fence just a little bit further apart. And this wasn't part of the original design, but it was something that I ended up doing so that I could get a wider board cut. One thing that does puzzle me is I'm pretty sure this saw came with a riving knife on the back. And I think I lost it when I was either dismantling or I was trying to do a thin groove cut, and the riving knife was getting in the way to the back of the blade. And so rather than try and fiddle around and adjust it, I took it off. So now this doesn't have a riving knife at the back of it, which can present its own problems and difficulties. While I don't really endorse, I'm not telling people to go out and do this, but I know a lot of people do. There's a lot of builders that will just clamp their saw to the underside of a piece of plywood, plunge cut the blade through, and then stick it to the top of a couple of sawhorses so that they can do some cuts while they're on site. I did this because I really wanted a table saw. I used to do that sort of thing where I'd clamp this upside down in this set of jaws that I used to have. I would clamp it in there so that I could run some cuts, and it just wasn't as stable. This is stable. If I'm trying to do really long cuts, it can get a little bit tippy. I have got one of those roller stands that I'll stick out the end to sort of support timber at the other side. I had someone ask if I could possibly do a video showing this off and explaining how I did it, because they saw me using it in my video on building the shed just behind us. I would love to get a proper contractor saw, mainly for probably the ease of adjustment for a fence, and being able to have a miter slot, because that's one thing this doesn't have. It's got a fence. It works really well, and I can adjust it quite easily. I just got to make sure I've got two clamps handy, and that's where I usually store that. Yeah, it's nice and stable. I have been considering making a bigger top, some different legs, that sort of stuff, but that hasn't come to fruition. I said I would like to get a bigger top. If I got something that was a little bit wider, I'd also think I'd like to recess the base plate so that I can get a little bit more of a cut, maybe another 1/4 inch depth of the cut, another 6mm, and that'd probably increase the usability of it. This is only the second blade that this saw has had in 20 years, and that's mainly because I do a lot of reclaiming, and these things have cut through an awful lot of boards with nails, and the tungsten carbide teeth have been good. The only reason I replaced it, this was, I think, when I was cutting up all the framing for that shed, I ended up realising I was losing teeth because I was using a lot of reclaimed decking frame. Anyway, that's how this saw is. If you're going to set up something like this, I'm going to say it straight out, you do so at your own peril. You've got to be absolutely certain you're going to be confident in using something like this. I am very confident in using this. I use a massive cabinet saw at work every day. That's a lot more dangerous than this. It's got no safety features in terms of like a saw stop, and it powers through heavy timber. This thing, you know your limitations of the saw. You don't try and push it too hard. And like I said, this thing has bitten me once, and it was through a lack of concentration. I was reaching for a push stick, turned my head, lost my concentration. But I was back on the saw the next day. I had a job to do. You don't need to be afraid of your tools, but you do need to be confident in your ability to use them. And I said, if you do something like this, it's on you. I'm just showing you how I made one. But the way I've set it up, this is a lot safer than just clamping it underneath a piece of plywood, because this is securely screwed. This is not going to move. I can set adjustable height, adjustable angles. I've done bevel cuts. Know the limitations of your abilities, your skills, your knowledge and your experience before doing something like this. If you're a brand new person to woodwork, go and buy a proper contractor saw. All right. Good boy, Bat. Here's Batman. Next time. There you go, little fella. I'll put you back. Crawl around now. Where are you going to go hang out? Yeah? Yeah, behind the door will do.